All right, welcome to History of Money. Professor Barth here, history professor at Arizona State University. Lecture 13. It's only a two-part lecture today. We're going to take a look at clipping and the invention of milled coinage in part A, and then for part B, we're going to dive into some monetary theory. And we're going to introduce this subject of bimetallism to our course, and we will revisit Gresham's law. But for part A, let's take a look at clipping. Clipping. Now, here's a photo of some Spanish pieces of 8. And you will notice immediately that these coins are not perfectly round. They're not perfectly round. Why is that? Well, that is because of clipping. Clipping was a byproduct of the way in which most European countries minted coins in the early modern era, and that was by the hammer, coinage by the hammer. Now, I've talked about this already a bit, but really for about 2,000 years, in most countries, except in the Far East and in parts of India, coins were made by the hammer. And just by way of review, a blank piece of metal was taken, and that blank piece of metal itself was actually came from or was cast from a mold. But you would take a blank piece of metal, place it between two dies, and then you would strike the upper die with a hammer, thus creating an impression on both sides of the coin. It's worked very well for about 2 millennia, and nevertheless, it has problems. It creates, or has a tendency to create, an irregular coinage. Perhaps the man behind the hammer, after doing it a few hundred times, really begins to get tired, or there's a shift in the movement, and the coin may be off center a bit. So that by the middle of the 17th century, there's a real demand for an updated way of making coins. Here are some hammered coins. And here are some others. And like this image, you'll notice some of the edges of the coin have been diminished. Not much in this case. Maybe about 5% of the coin has been clipped. But sometimes for these hammered coins, the clipping would be a lot worse. I'll have some images coming up. What is clipping? Clipping was the cropping of small amounts of metal from the edge of the coin with shears, and then passing off that coin with a reduced silver content, passing it off at face value while retaining the small amount of silver that you had clipped or cropped from the coin. This is a hoard of silver clippings. This was actually from the medieval period. This hoard was discovered in an archaeological dig. So whoever this belonged to was in the habit of taking coins and then clipping small amounts from the edges and then passing them off at face value and then retaining the extra. And clipping goes back to the days of Roman Empire and even before that. But clipping was common in the Middle Ages in Europe, and it was a crime punishable by death in many countries, if not most countries. So it was a serious crime to commit, and the state enforced this law. By the way, I mean, if you were caught clipping money, you were brought before a judge, and if convicted, you received the death penalty in many cases, or at the very least, you were branded, perhaps on the cheek. This was not uncommon if you were convicted of clipping to brand the letter C on your cheek for clipper, or to have your ears cropped. That was another common punishment for clipping, but in many cases it was a death penalty. And the reason why was that the argument was by defacing the king's coin, by defacing the the coin that represents the sovereignty of the monarch, you're essentially committing treason against that monarch. You're committing fraud and fraudulently passing this coin that you have defaced and passing it off as legitimate. And so it was a strict punishment. However, clipping was hard to catch. Right? The man who, clipped the silver off these coins got away with it, most likely. And the way to catch it would be if you entered a merchant's house and they saw the equipment, and then immediately suspicious, and then especially if you conducted a search and you found these, then all right, this man is guilty of clipping. But otherwise, it was actually quite difficult to catch, and therefore it was very common. Very common. Let's take a look at some extreme instances of clipping. Look at these. These are Spanish pieces of 8. These are all Spanish pieces of 8, and they are so deformed by clippers that it's hardly recognizable. I mean, look at some of these shapes. In this case, it's clipped by about half. And even on some of the better ones, maybe about 10% of the coin is clipped. So like I said, even though the punishment was steep, it was difficult to catch, and so it was pretty common. Actually, pirates were notorious for clipping. A pirate or a privateer would plunder silver from a ship and from a Spanish galleon, and then would proceed to clip edges off the coin, and then go to a Carolina or New York or wherever and spend a clipped coin while retaining the remaining amount of silver. Very tempting thing to do. Here's some other instances of clipped monies. This is from the Roman era. Just goes to show you that clipping dates back very far. Now, this created a whole lot of inconveniences. Merchants, for the most part, would accept clipped coin, but they always weighed them on scales because the merchant's concerned about the intrinsic value of the coin. How much silver is in this coin? And to figure that out, you're going to have to weigh it because it's deformed. It's clearly not worth what it would be in its full weight. So merchants weighed the coin. Now, that's an inconvenience. You have to have scales and all the rest. Most ordinary people don't have scales. And with some exceptions, for the most part, ordinary people actually circulated these clipped coins at face value. Unless it was just ridiculously clipped. Maybe in the case of this coin right here, you would have had some ordinary people hesitating a bit before taking it. But a coin like this one, or even that one, most people are going to accept at face value. That is, as an ordinary piece of 8. This is what made clipping profitable, because if people didn't accept coins at face value, then there's no profit then to clipping, because a certain amount of pence or whatever the denominational unit is would be deducted from the coin's value. But the fact that people circulate them at face value is what made it profitable. So the response to this was an invention called mid-seventeenth coinage. This invention, which first really took off in France in the 1640s, but then was adopted in England by the 1660s, placed grooves on the edge of the coin. It wasn't made by the hammer, but was made by machine. So here's a milling machine. So you see the machine there. In this machine, you'll see the grooves. Placing the grooves on the coin, and created a much more uniform, regular currency, perfectly round. The grooves on the edge of the coin made it very easy to detect whether or not any silver had been, or gold had been, clipped from the edge of the coin. just a far more and actually beautiful piece as well. It wasn't as irregular looking. A finer piece and invulnerable to clipping, because it was obvious to anybody when, if anybody tried to clip metal from a milled coin. Now, when milled money was introduced, this created a problem at first, because there were still old hammered coins that by this point were quite clipped in circulation. And so I'm looking, the example we're going to look at here is England in the 17th century. That happens to be my area of expertise, and so it's one reason why I landed on England as a case study of this. But it's a pretty good case study. So England introduced milled money in the 1660s, or the English monarchy did. This is very fine, weighty, beautiful money. There's King Charles II. But they didn't recoin all of the money of the kingdom, and so you still had the old hammered coins from Queen Elizabeth in circulation. You still had the old hammered silver coins from King Charles I in circulation, and they were clipped 5, 10%, in some cases 15 or even 20%. And ordinary people accepted them at face value. It's created quite the problem, because if you think about it, if people are accepting these coins at face value and they have about 10 or 15% of the silver missing, why would you ever, if you got your hands on this beautiful, weighty, perfectly round milled money, why would you ever choose to spend this money when you could spend this money instead? What we see occur in England in the late 17th century was Gresham's law. Gresham's law. You'll remember from our discussion of the late Roman Empire. And also I brought up the United States in the late 20th century when the silver was taken out of the U.S. dime. We talked about Gresham's law. Bad money chases out good money. If you have bad money, quote unquote, and good money circulating side by side, inevitably the good money will leave circulation and the bad money will dominate circulation. In this case, the good money is this, and the bad money is the old clipped, hammered coinage. And so, in this particular example, Gresham's law goes into place and the new milled money left circulation. People either hoarded it or exported it out of the country. And as soon as, hammered coins enter circulation, they left circulation. Nobody's going to spend full weight silver milled money when you could spend sort of this decrepit old hammered coinage at the same value, at the same rate. So hammered coinage dominated, the new milled money fled circulation. Clipping became worse as it was clear that there was profit in circulating clip money, and it became just an all-out crisis for the English government. The English government finally responded in 1696 by saying, all right, hold up. Because by 1696, the old hammered coinage from Queen Elizabeth and King Charles I and King James I was all clipped by like 30%. I mean, it was really, really bad. It was a full-blown crisis in England. And so the English government in Parliament said, oh, nope, we're all done with this. And this dramatic event, this massive episode in monetary history, withdrew all of the coin in England from circulation and recoined all of that old hammered and clipped money. It happened, by the way, in the middle of a war with France. That's how bad this was. Even though we're in the middle of a war with France, we've got to do this. And for about a 6 or 9 month period, there was no money in England. just because it was all sent to the mint to recoin into this new milled money. And it caused a lot of havoc, as you can imagine. All the money's ejected from circulation, but ended up fixing the problem, because after 1696, it was all milled money, and this time the milled money was able to stay in circulation because there was no longer any hammered, clipped money to compete with it via Gresham's law. So for part B, we're going to take a look at bimetallism, and we'll have another instance of Gresham's law. So Gresham's law appears quite a bit for lecture 13. So I look forward to seeing you for part B of lecture 13.